Now I'm excited to introduce Joel Third and welcome you to tonight's program. Joel is going to talk about the role of Currier and Ives in 19th century American mass media. And I'm still letting in people. Joel has been an avid collector for almost 40 years. Due to his interest in history, he owns a collection of Currier and Ives prints that he has made available to the museum for all sorts of programs. Joel's originally from Northeastern Ohio, where he graduated from Case Western Reserve University with a degree in electrical engineering. As for his professional life, he traveled all around the globe. And anybody who's been to Joel's wonderful apartment knows it's like going into a museum, literally, because he has artifacts and pieces of art from everywhere. He's one of the only people who's been to all 7 continents. So I'm very impressed with that. Joel and his late wife, Betty Jane, moved to Richfield in 1992. A longtime board member of Keelertown Museum and History Center, Joel is also a board member of the Rotary Club, Richfield Symphony Orchestra, the Richfield Men's Club, the Graveyard Committee, and is a facilitator at Founders Hall. This is the first in a series of several talks where Joel will share his wonderful collection of the historic Currier and Ives prints with us and provide insights into the American psyche of the 19th century. The second program is set for Thursday, February the 18th, also at 6:30 p.m., and will explore the role of women in the 18th century as seen through Currier and Ives. The registration is already up on our website. Okay, so now I am going to turn it over to Joel. Joel, please.
Good. Well, good evening, everybody. Do we have full screen, Hildy, or am I part of the pack here?
You're good.
Good. All right. Well, I'm certainly pleased that everybody's here. And I have 2 close family members. My sister from Florida is on, and my dear niece from Denver is on. So I'm very pleased that they were able to get on. This Zoom is just fantastic. It's really extended the reach of the museum. And we've had programs now for people from New Zealand, from Europe, and so on. So it's a marvelous technology. Well, getting right into it, the Currier and Ives, we have a collection, and we're to the point where we really like to share it with the public, because there's a lot of rich, not only the artwork, but the history behind these things. So by sharing it, well, number one, Currier really documented for the public the whole spectrum of the 19th century, starting at about 1834. They lasted all the way through till the beginning of the 20th century. So they were very marketing oriented. So they reflected what the people wanted, the concepts and so on. Most of it, I would say 90% of it is very positive and good, but there were some really negative things as well, which we'll bring up. So what we're going to do is essentially start with the background of Currier. And since there's so many different genres involved, we'll have different programs as we go along in the future for like rail and waterways and the wonderful steamboat activity on the Mississippi and the Hudson, etc. So there's a lot to look forward to. And then our next one is focused on women's rights and the way women were treated in the 19th century. And that is not as positive as this program. Anyhow, we're going to get started. I'm going to at least try here, see if we can share. Okay. All right. Little by little, we're getting there. Okay. I hope everybody sees that. All right. There's so much stuff on here. I guess I'm co-host, so that gives me all these little other possibilities. Anyhow, this particular print was 2 ships that were used to transport people from New York City up to Albany. And it was part of the railway system off from Albany all the way through to Chicago. They made the trip overnight and then back the next day. So one going one direction and one coming back. And they were marvelous vessels. So tonight's program, after the introduction, we're going to talk a little bit about the formation of the U.S. in the 19th century and everything that was going on. A little bit about lithography, Currier Ives, the firm, examples of the prints, and then some of the artists that were employed by Currier Ives, and then our future programs. There's also references, if anybody's interested, we can provide those. So, America in the 19th century. It was a fantastic growth from 13 million to 60 million from 1834 to about 1880. That's a pretty substantial growth. Women's rights and temperance were pursued by activists. Urbanization from 1830 to 1860 in New York City exploded about 300% from 200,000 to 800,000 people. The farm population, however, plunged from 83 to 50% by 1850 as the people were coming to the cities. The immigration, about 500,000 arrived in just in 1830 alone. And between 47 and 54, 1.2 million came from Ireland during the potato famine, and more came from Germany after a failed a revolution in Germany. A lot of Germans came over, and plus there were people still coming from Great Britain, meaning Scotland, Wales, and there were three major conflicts: War of 1812, the Mexican War, Mexican-American War, and the War with Spain in the late part of the 19th century, plus the Civil War to boot. So there was a lot of activities on that front. Emancipation of the enslaved population. American territory exploded from 13 little colonies on the Atlantic Ocean in 1783 to the Pacific Ocean in 65 years by 1848. That is really remarkable. Industrial development started and was accelerated by the War of 1812. Probably during the war, after the war, we realized we weren't making a lot of stuff, and we were still importing a lot of things from our old nemesis England and from Europe and other places. So we had to develop our own industrialization, which started at about that time in earnest. Plus the transportation, built out of canals, rail, and ships. This country really wouldn't have developed like we have today if it hadn't been for the waterways. And that's why the canals and the ships were so important, and the steamships. With our river systems and so on, we were able to populate and to really develop the whole continent, our part of the continent. The last item, which is interesting, we had to develop our own history and usable past. By what do I mean by that? Well, all the immigrants coming from Europe, they didn't want to hear about the castles and all the English kings and so on. So we had to develop an American history for these people to learn and to pass on to their offspring. So that was part of the role that Currier Ives played. Okay, what is lithography? Lithography is a method of printing. It was really invented in 1796 in Bavaria by Elos. That was a difficult one for me. Sennenfelder. He was actually an actor, and he stumbled on this technology, and then used it to make scripts for his plays and actually grocery lists and so on, which is kind of interesting. So it was really by accident that he invented it. It wasn't introduced into the U.S. until 1818. It had already been in Europe, in France, and Germany. and probably England. The process itself is much faster and cheaper than metal engraving, which had been used before, or wood engraving or wood cuts. So this was a real advance in the ability to communicate in the communication field. Application. Lithography was really a mass media in America, and also for general printing. They printed all sorts of forms and contracts, etc., with lithography. While in Europe, it was really confined to fine arts. They were reproducing Rembrandts and all the fine arts that they possessed. The hub of lithography in the United States was New York City. By 1880, there were 130 different firms. They were busy making prints of various kinds. Now, Currier Ives really dominated the field with 95% of the prints in circulation by the end of the century, producing over 7,000 titles in their 73-year history. The firm sold millions of prints in Canada, Europe, Australia, and Currier Ives was an excellent example of a market-driven firm responding very closely to customer preferences and requirements. It was a very successful firm. Okay, well, how does it work? Well, it's actually litho, meaning stone in Greek, and lithography part is the graphic part is meaning print or put on the paper. The limestone that was started in this process was from Bavaria because of that's where Sennenfelder was from, and it was probably the best limestone for this. It had been a pocket of limestone in an area between Munich and Nuremberg that was created 155 million years ago during the Jurassic period. And it was a very fine limestone that lent itself very nicely to printing. And they also find a lot of fossils in there, but we're not going to deal with that tonight. So it's actually a stone from 3 to 5 inches thick, and the small ones were like maybe 20 inches by 10 by 20. The larger stones got as big as say 30 inches by 25 inches or so. So the small ones weighed about 15 pounds and the large ones weighed up to 500 pounds. So you can imagine this was logistically, this was a very difficult process to actually physically implement. It took a lot of manpower to make this work. First, the stone had to be, there was graining. The surface of the stone was ground to a very fine velvety finish. You're probably using another stone and a little bit of adhesive. The drawing then was placed directly on the stone. Now, this was done by a crayon, which was made up of waxy material, wax, soap, lambac for color, or by using a transfer paper. Now, once it was on the stone, you couldn't erase it. It was impossible. You had to regrain the stone and start all over again. So the term on stone is significant because that meant the artist worked directly on the stone if they weren't working with transfer paper. Then the stone was washed with acid to affix the waxed drawing to the stone, and then it was washed with water. So the whole thing is based on the fact that grease and water, or oil and water, don't mix. And that's the fundamental technology we're dealing with here. So the ink was also composed of greasy, waxy material, shellac, lambac, and so on. And then it was rolled on the stone, which the ink then only adhered to the drawing, the greasy drawing. It would not adhere to the rest of the stone, which was wet with water, and it was repelled by the water. So that was the basis of the the whole process. Now, the printing was all black and white at this point because of the nature of the ink, and that's what they had. Later on, they actually made chromolithography, which was multiple stones. If you can believe, each stone was a different color, and they would have up to 5 or 6 different stones, and the registration had to be perfect for the print to come out. Audubon did some of that later on in that process, but we won't go into that tonight. So once the ink was put on the stone, adhering only to the drawing, the paper was placed on the stone and then put in the press. Now the press was rather light because you didn't have to push down too hard like in the engravings, which you had to squeeze the ink out of the engravings. So the paper was lightly pressed down on the ink of the drawing, and then you ended up with a black and white print. Now, to color them, you required hand coloring at this point in time. When Currier Ives primarily only did hand coloring. The small prints were done by mass production. They had usually women from immigrant women from Europe would sit around a table. Each one would be a different color. There'd be a master print, put a finished print in the middle of the table, and the blue would put their blue on the print as it was passed around. The green would be put on the green, and so on. And they'd have a quality assurance person at the end to make sure it turned out all right. If not, they just discarded it and they'd have to get another print. Talk a little bit about the firm itself. This was one of their big logos, and as Hildy pointed out the other day, it only says the Currier, Nathaniel Currier on this little thing, because he started the program in 1834. Ives didn't come along until the 1850s. So when this emblem was made, it was just Currier lithography. And it was engravings for the people, and he was very serious about that. So they really were a mass media firm. If we can, now we certainly know what mass media is in today's environment. And this is how the information got out to the public. They existed for 73 years, from 1834 up to 1907. The founder of the organization was Nathaniel Currier. He was born up in Roxbury, Massachusetts. He was very and he had plenty of charm. He had a critical eye, artistic judgment, remarkable awareness of public taste. That was the basis of the marketing, and a very shrewd business sense. His ideal partner was Ives, as this was Charles Currier's, which was Nathaniel's brother-in-law, who joined the firm in 52 as a bookkeeper. He was actually in finance, but he was also, he provided stability and profitability to the firm, or ensured it. He was made partner in 57, but he also fit quite well into the as an artistic critic, an artist, a lithographer himself, and he was responsible for overseeing a lot of the prints that were made. And he he was instrumental. The whole crew worked as a team on many of the prints. Some specialized in the scenery, some people specialized in horses, some people specialized in people, etc. And he would sort of orchestrate that. So Ives was actually born in New York City at Bellevue. His father was the caretaker, I believe, at Bellevue, and that's where he was born. This is a picture of their storefront on Nassau Street. Both their whole existence was in Lower Manhattan. They were true New Yorkers. That factory, which would produce a lot of the prints, was over on Spruce, and all this is down in Lower Manhattan. So this is where they would sell the prints. The prints were also sold to the street vendors and the push cart guys. They would come by, get a load of prints, and then go off at various parts of the city and sell them. So that was a big distribution. And then they were shipped overseas, as we indicated earlier, and up to Canada and all over the place. Their mission statement was pretty simple. They wanted to be the grand central depot for, I like the word inexpensive versus cheap, but they actually used cheap and popular in there was nothing cheap about their work, excuse me. But the big thing was popular prints. They had to sell. That's how they survived. So they had to be the best, cheapest, most popular firm in a democratic country. They never intended to produce fine art. So they would concentrate on, as you will see, drawings that were popular in the general public. Their aspiration was to make sure that prints made it into the homes of the new middle class dwellings, which was developing because of the industrialization. And the new middle class really couldn't afford the paintings of Europe and the high art. So they would get the Currier Ives and put them on their walls for decoration. They were also put in stores, barber shops, firehouses. They were all over the place. Bar rooms and barns. I think some of the prints I have are probably from barns, the way it actually turned out. But anyhow, that's another story. They have quite an eclectic collection of imagery, and it was all market driven. They got their, Nathaniel really got his start back in about 1840, when there was this terrible disaster from one of the Vanderbilt steamboats right down here in the bay. I think it was going from New York to Stone Harbor or somewhere along the coast, and it caught fire and sank. With 100 souls were lost in this terrible disaster. So the Sun, which was a newspaper, started in about 1833 in Manhattan and lasted actually until about 1950. So it was a substantial newspaper of the time. They had no real technology for making pictures. It would be labor intensive and it would be too long. So Nathaniel proved the versatility and the utility of lithography by producing this print in about 2 days, something of that nature, and turned out a lot of copies of it, which were put into the Sun Extra, which was a special edition of the Sun. And that print made it all the way across the country. And you can imagine, without TV, without other mechanisms, this was what the people saw and how they appreciated the extent of this disaster. Now, why Currier Ives really took off and people were still talking about him. Obviously, you recognize this guy, President Roosevelt he was a collector. And he loved the naval prints because he was assistant naval secretary of the naval relations, or the Navy Department. And this is one of course, Currier's famous prints he's looking at, and that you see here on the desk is some ships that were done by Currier. Now, this picture was taken in the old print shop on Lexington Avenue at 30th. That shop still exists, and I know some of the people there. I bought prints there through the years, and it's a great old facility that's been there for over a century. And they are still one of the prime dealers in Currier Ives prints. So that's really what started the collecting aspect and making sure they were saved back in the early 20th century. The other people who promoted this was Harry Peters, and you'll see his quotations and information in some parts of this exhibit or this program. And he was a collector, researcher, and lecturer who really a lot of Currier Ives prints. And his collection is at the Museum of the City of New York today. The other promoter was Charles Messer Stowe, who was the antiques editor of the Sun. So it all sort of fit together. That's what promoted the collection of these prints. Now, how do you tell when you got 7,000 titles, what is worth collecting and how do you judge them? Well, back in 1933, Harry Shaw Newman, who was at the old print shop, and got together with Sun, the newspaper, the antiques editor, and said, how are we going to do this? So why don't we get a couple people together, select some of the best prints of Currier, put them in the newspaper for people to vote on. So they had a vote throughout New York City, and the people picked 50 small and 50 large Currier Ives prints, and they were published in a book, not this particular book, but an earlier book. This process was renewed in 1988, but this time it was done by a panel of experts, including the Print Collectors Society, and they selected started out with 100 prints from the voting of their own members of the Print Collectors Society, and they were boiled down to 50 small and 50 large. A lot of the prints in the collection fit in this category. So this is the way you sort of boil down 7,000 different titles. So let's take a look at some of these prints. This was a very famous one. I have one copy of this, but it's not quite as good as this one. And this is Nathaniel Currier himself and his second wife, probably up in Massachusetts somewhere. So the other point of this whole thing is, this is what everybody, when they think of Currier Ives, they think of the Christmas cards and the Christmas prints. Well, as you're going to see, they were a lot more and played a bigger role than just these type of prints. In fact, they were known equally for a lot of different genres. So you'll get to see some more of these prints. This is a beautiful print of the original, early Central Park, the skating. This would be around 1850-ish or 1850s. And this is showing the beginnings really of the middle class. The working class and the immigrants were all still in lower Manhattan. So on. And the people who could afford the sleighs or their chauffeurs would bring them up to skating. So these people were really probably not only the middle class, but the upper middle class in Manhattan. And of course, horses was the main way of transport. But this is a beautiful print, and I have a copy of this one. Now, besides the original print they did with the Lexington of the Vanderbilt ship that sunk, they also recorded the other disasters in American history. And this particular print here is of the Chicago fire of 1871. Yes, 1871. And I didn't realize there were 300 people were killed and about 3 square miles of area were destroyed. Over 100,000 people became homeless from this disaster. After this, they rebuilt with more stone, brick, and so on. Most of the building at this point was wood, and it went up very quickly. So this is one of the things they did, was to provide this kind of information. So the other thing you have to remember, a lot of the immigrants couldn't speak English. Obviously, the Irish and the English and so on could, but the Germans and the French and so on would be just learning the language. And so these images were really helpful in explaining to them what was happening and provide a news outlet for them, so they could see what was really happening in the country. So that's another role that these things played. Now, the Civil War. Obviously, the Union is always portrayed as the winning battle, brilliant battle strategists, etc., well-dressed, etc., in these prints. And the poor Confederates over here are, in this case, hardly visible, all gray and so on. This happens to be a particularly interesting print. This was the Battle of the Roanoke Island, which was in the early part of the Civil War, and captured the various sounds in the waterways just off the coast of North Carolina, around the Outer Banks. And the Union maintained, after they won this battle, maintained that territory for the rest of the war. These particular troops are the Suave troops, which started in France, actually North Africa. They were, I'm talking about the nomenclature. These people are all Americans. So the regiments started in probably Algeria from the Berbers, made it into the French army, and then they were observed by some of the military people from the American army, decided to set up some of these regiments. This particular one was the New York 9th Hawkins Regiment. Sports. This is the only print of baseball of Currier Ives. From 1866, it was a championship game, and at that time there were 200 clubs in the National Association. The important thing about this print, and some of the things that you learn when you study these, and I never noticed it, but none of these men have gloves, no baseball gloves. They were handling the ball with just with their bare hands. This changed later on, obviously, but they were felt that if they used a glove, that was just too feminine, and they needed real men to play this game, etc. So, but I guess they learned after some pretty messed up hands. So this is, as I said, the only baseball drawing that they did. And these people were probably different classes, probably some working class and some of the higher echelon. There was a lot of class distinction in that period, of course. Horse racing was really the big thing. Oh, they loved their horses, all kinds. The thoroughbreds, the trotters, they bet on everything. And a lot of the drawings had all the statistics and the names of the horses. And that was very popular to present to the public. You can imagine, horse racing was really a big thing. The other sport was ice boat. This one happened to be on the Hudson. We have a copy of this. And here they're trying to race a train. Obviously, they were much faster. Some of these ice boats got up to 100 miles an hour. At least that's what I read. Couldn't believe it. That must have been horribly dangerous. They hit a crevasse or something on the ice. That would be the end of it, going that fast. So this was very popular, probably started by the Dutch. And it was promoted. And you can see in those days, the Hudson really froze. I don't think that would happen today. So anyhow, this is it's kind of a scarce print and a popular print. And it's a small one. The small, by the way, were run about something like across about 12 inches by 8 inches or so, something like that, what we would consider small. The bigger ones are run like 28 inches by 18 inches, something of that nature. This is another small print.
Joel, could I just throw in a question from an audience member?
Sure.
The question is around cost or value of cost of prints as a collector.
Collection. Well, I would really like to discuss that offline. I don't want to be throwing numbers around, but they vary in price all over, and they're available in auctions and dealers. So it depends on the rarity of the print, popularity, rarity. Some of them are still pretty reasonable, down in the just in a few dollars to a few $100s. Others can go quite high. I've seen prints as high as like $30,000. These are rare, large, rare prints, and I don't have any of those. But so there's a wide spectrum. And again, it depends on the quality of the print. Now, talking about quality, one question always leads into another here. They use the finest inks available, the watercolors, to color them, probably from Austria, and they used the best paper, and they didn't have any acid in the paper. They were all rag paper. So that's why they're lasting. Prints made out of the newspaper print and that sort of thing just totally disintegrated from the acid content. Plus, if the print had been exposed to light for a long period of time, it would fade out, and so on. But again, they used the best quality materials, which is sort of interesting, wanting to be an inexpensive provider of prints, but yet they use the highest quality material, which is a benefit to us today because that means the prints lasted. If you have any other questions, Hildy, just pop in.
Yeah. So Joel, along this line of questioning is there's a question about how many prints would they make of each image, and are they numbered, or were they numbered somehow?
No, the answer to numbering is no. That is a problem for a collector. We do have an index. Somebody went to the trouble of categorizing all these prints and giving them a number. And you'll see when you have the chance to see the prints down at the museum that we have here, they all have a number from Cunningham. And that's a book that was put together in the 20th century, but they were not numbered by Currier. These people actually put them in alphabetical order, all the 7,000 prints they could find, and give them a number. What was the other part of the question? How many they made?
Copies of each?
It was purely a function of how many they were selling. Because once you prepare a lithographic stone, you could just put it aside and then reprint later on because the image held. That was another beauty of the lithography. You didn't lose the capability. So they would sell some and then sell some more. So there's cases we know that hundreds of thousands of prints were made. Others probably not so many. And there's no records, so nobody knows for sure. All we know is that there's a lot of prints around, different with the 7,000 different titles. But some of the more popular ones, like the rails, were very popular prints. So these are still available. This is a small print, by the way. This image was taken, was observed over in Jersey City, a cut coming out on the old Erie Railway. And we're going to talk a little bit about the people who made these in a minute. But these are great prints. I love the rail system of prints. And you can imagine they were very popular, especially men would really appreciate these.
So Joel, just one more question about cost. So this print, around 1870, what would that have cost? And would it have come framed or just, unframed?
Oh, at the time, no. You would have to frame it. These were just flat out prints. There was no framing unless you did that yourself or had them framed. We have antique frames that were obviously made at the time using wood backing, which was full of acid, which was really a problem. No, you bought them as straight prints. That's why the vendors along the street, they would just have a stack of them of various kinds from that day's production that they would be selling. So that's how they were sold. And at the time when they were made, a print like this would go for a nickel or maybe a dime, but that was back 150 years ago. The bigger prints were selling for about $3. So you multiply that up by about 25, I think, the multiplier for the inflation on the dollar. but they were within the reach of the general public at the time, the small especially. So that, yes, that's how they really made it. There was a good enough margin on that, so it didn't cost them much to produce it. That was another beauty of the lithography. So they made their money and kept the firm going for the 70 some odd years. Now this is a part of the story which is pretty sad. After the Civil War, during the Reconstruction, and we all know the history, there was the Jim Crow laws were enacted in the South to prevent the blacks, African Americans, from voting, participating in the government. So they, for whatever reason, they got the idea to make these prints, and they were one of the most popular series that they had, believe it or not, in the latter part of the 19th century. And it gives you a little bit of understanding of some of the problems we're still working on today, because these pictures were called the Darktown series. And the idea was to denigrate and to ridicule the African Americans as much as they could for anything they were involved with, like whether it be, in this case, sailing or the fire department. And there's a whole series of these prints, which they felt, well, I'll give you a description in a minute, but this particular one was, this woman here was trying to get in the ship or the boat, whatever skiff, whatever that is. And of course, tipped over the whole thing and everybody went helter-skelter. But this is the kind of thing that, this is when I mentioned that was selling in the hundreds of thousands of prints. And they had about 100 different titles in this series. And it's really sad part of our history. And again, all this was hand colored. These are all small, by the way. They didn't make any large ones of this. Now, just to give you an idea of the feeling of the public and Currier themselves, this came out of one of the not novels. One of the books written about Currier and Ives from an academic point of view is Brian LeBeau, which I've had that book for a while, and the museum has a copy as well. And he goes into all of the background of a lot of these types, various genres that they did. And in this particular case, they were demonstrating a total lack of racial sensitivity and social responsibility, but it was market driven. And this market driven firm produced these prints. And this is how they described them when they were questioned about it. They were pleasant and humorous designs, free from coarseness or vulgarity, being good-natured hits. I'm sure the blacks really felt they were good-natured, at popular amusements of the times. So this gives you a clue as to what a market-driven company will do when the public it feels in this way. So it gives you a little idea of what the background of what we're dealing with today. So we won't dwell on this. Maybe later on we'll have a whole discussion about this part of the Currier and Ives drawings. I mentioned earlier about creating a history for America, for creating our own American history. And here's an example of the Pilgrims landing at Plymouth Rock. The amazing thing about Curriers, they're always somewhat imaginary, in the sense like these guys are dressed like they just get out of the, a nice dress shop, or it looks like they had new clothes and washed and all this. No, they were pretty bad off when they arrived. So they were always upbeat. They were always created drawings that were positive. You never saw any of the real problems of the day, the homelessness or the poverty or the hungry areas of the country that existed at that time. They were always reflecting sort of, well, as LeBeau points out, it was sort of as America was imagined, so to speak. So they did not reflect the actual situation. They reflected what, in a way, they felt the country should really look like. And of course, in this case, you have this poor Native American over here. It's a big story. It doesn't reflect the true nature of the story. But this guy looks like it's, like there goes the neighborhood type of attitude. But, you could go on forever talking about any one of these prints. And here's the Mayflower sitting out here in the harbor. Now, the other part that it became very obvious in the collection, there's no mention of Jamestown, 1608, not one word. It was New England centric. So, both Nathaniel and Ives, Currier and Ives, were both New England centric or East Coast centric, New York centric. So they didn't dwell much on this period. And the other thing they didn't touch on was the whole colonial period with England and France. There's not one print that deals with the colonial period. They picked up when the Revolutionary War, some images, and then of course later on when we were a nation. But before that, for the couple hundred years, there's no mention of the colonial period. They started out with Columbus and then Jamestown, and then they jumped right into the Revolutionary War and so on. So that was another interesting aspect of the Currier and Ives productions. We have these are all down at the Keeler Tavern. These are all about Lincoln. These are all original prints, and we have all these. And we probably get some more on Lincoln. They're all black and white. It revolves around his assassination and his funeral processions in New York, the displaying of the casket, his deathbed, and this is the signing of the Emancipation Proclamation. This is actually an engraving. It was copied from a painting. So these are primary source materials that the museum uses for the educational programs. So it's really meaningful. And the reason that primary sources are so important, having a copy of something versus one of the original drawings, prints, or whatever, is really significant. At least it is for me. And I think it has an impact maybe on some of the students as well. Hey, this is what really existed at the time. And we can make copies of these things, but this is the real thing. This is what existed then. None of these were, well, some were colored, but it was, in this case, it's really appropriate not to have them colored. Okay, we'll talk a little bit about the actual artists. Fanny Palmer was one of their best, most talented, versatile, and collaborative artists. She did over 200 prints herself. She was English educated. She was from Leicester, England, and educated in London. She did everything. She did the railways. She did the Mississippi River, Hudson River, hunting, fishing, fruits and flowers, and farm backgrounds, etc. She wasn't great with people, so that's where some of the other artists got involved. Now, Louis Mauer was a German immigrant. He lived to be 100 years old. He was born on the Rhine, and he immigrated to the U.S. He was very talented with human and animal figures, and he would put the human and animal figures in Fanny's farm prints. So that's how they worked together. He was also known for his fireman series, and all those horses, some of which you saw, were done by Louis, and he did Westerns. Now, the other aspect that I have to point out, Fanny never saw the Mississippi River. She never saw a Mississippi River steamboat in her life. She relied on descriptions, maybe some drawings, etc., and made these spectacular prints that we're going to be showing in a second. Lewis never went to the West, he was able to do the Westerns. So a lot of this time, again, is part of the fact that a lot of these were images were what they was imagined rather than the real thing, but they made it as close to the real thing as possible. Excuse me. Now, this is a couple of Fanny's prints. I think this is an absolutely spectacular. This is a very expensive, large print. I don't have a copy of this. This is the one of the trail, the Oregon Trail, or one of the trails. And again, the Native Americans are shown, but there are some images about the Native Americans, but in general, they were pretty much pushed aside and ignored. This is one of Fanny's pictures of the steamboats on the Mississippi, and that's right behind me on the wall. We have this one. These ships are really fascinating to look at. And you'll notice that the flames are literally coming from the stacks. That means these boilers, this is a race of some kind. They were having a race. They used to have these crazy races. And the captains would fire those boilers up to the point where they explode. The technology wasn't totally sound in some of these ships. And you could see these things were really moving here. I mean, no, the speed was only maybe 12, 15 miles an hour, but they had the steam at such a high pressure that it was very dangerous. And you can see the fire from the boilers were literally coming out the stack. But these are beautiful prints. Now, this is a editorial from a Cincinnati newspaper describing these steamboats, which is fascinating. Steamboat was the most colorful, dramatic, and vital fact of life in mid-America. You can imagine the cities were just developing. They weren't particularly nice. I mean, St. Louis and all these other towns along the river. But you got on one of these ships, and it was a different world, like taking a crazy cruise, I guess, today. Rushing down the river as the wings of wind, walking against the mighty currents, bearing the ships were bearing the speculators, the merchants, the dandies, and the fine ladies. Pianos and stacks of novels and cards and dice. There was a lot of gambling. Flirting and lovemaking. That must have been interesting. Drinking champagne. A steamboat brings to the very doors of your cabin a bit of Paris, a section of Broadway, a slice of Philadelphia, the eastern cities, to ferment in the minds of our young people the intimate propensity for fashion and finery. So this was a way of stepping into a real luxurious existence for a day or two as you went from, say, St. Louis down to New Orleans. Probably maybe took 3 days. But in any case, they were very popular. Now, as far as Louis Maurer is concerned, here's one of his fireman prints from the, this is the whole story in itself. They had these volunteer fire departments, and they would get in fights with one another on the way to the fire to be the first there. So it got so bad that the city of New York had to start the Metropolitan Fire Department because it was too dangerous for these guys to be out fighting among themselves. So what I'm saying is a lot of these prints bring on all kinds of stories. In this particular case, is Nathaniel Currier was an actual volunteer fireman, and they think that he modeled for this. Now, two of the artists that they used, now that's a different, Fanny and Lewis were actual lithographers, drew on stone. Now they were drawing these things with these crayons on the stone, like those beautiful ships, backwards. You can imagine the talent these people had. Now these are traditional artists oil on canvas type of artists, that they would buy some of their paintings and then reproduce them. Tate did a lot of, Tate loved the wilderness of the US. He came from England and he had some property up in the Adirondacks, and they did some of the prints up there of the hunting and canoeing and so on. And then Duryea was a Connecticut boy from New Haven, and he's was one of the best producers of the farm scenes in the winter, especially what we saw on a Christmas card type prints, and he was called the Snowman. They only used 12 of his scenes, and the rest of them were really from Fanny, including, we're going to show you here, the Autumn in New England, which we now have down at the tavern. It's the cider making in New England. Here's one of the Western prints that Lewis was involved with. No, Tate did the print. Tate did the painting, I should say. He never went out here either. These were from stories and from writings. But there's so much motion here. They're so dramatic. Really, I have a copy of this print. It's really nice. Really enjoy this one. So this would be a painting from Tate that they would buy from him and then reproduce it. Here's the one from Duryea of the cider making here in the shed. And this is probably a scene here in Connecticut or somewhere in New England. It's a very pretty print. This picture does not do it justice.
Joel, I have a question from the audience. Would the
Sure.
artist sign their prints? Or
It varied. I do have some prints with some signatures, or at least down in the nomenclature, it says who did it. But generally, because it was a collaborative thing, they weren't signed. But once in a while, you'll see a signature. And in some of the cases, like with Tate, it was always known that Tate did this. It wasn't a signature in the normal sense of a painting. Usually down here somewhere, you'll see that who, if they wanted, they could put their name here, or it would be put there by the firm themselves. But that was not a big thing. Sometimes it's hard to identify. Sometimes you just know who did it. I think in this case, I think Duryea did sign this one. But it would be the original painting sign. And whether that was transferred into the lithography or not would be a different story. So it was a whole different way of looking at things. So what's next in this story? Well, as Hildy mentioned, on the 18th of February, we're going to talk about how women were viewed, their struggles in the 19th century, all the way from their position in the house to their activity with the voting and with temperance. Temperance brings up a lot of memories. When I was a small lad in Northern Ohio, I won't tell you how old I was, but I actually signed a pledge from the WCTU, the Women's Christian Temperance Union. It still existed. But after I got older, I got beyond 10, or well, a lot older than that. Probably when I hit college, I had totally forgotten about my pledge. Anyhow, you could go on forever with these stories. Future presentations will portray the genres of the rich variety of the Currier prints, such as the African American plight, the Native peoples, Civil War, steamboats, Mississippi and Hudson River development, the railroads in the U.S., which really just exploded in their capacities and development, and other topics. And when the pandemic is finally over, we will have exhibits down at the Keeler Tavern with the actual prints, and you'll get to see them up close and personal. So this is a preview of the women's plight in the 19th century. Here depicts men are really worried that they're going to have to take over the household duties of washing and childbearing or child watching, while the women are out gallivanting around here. So that's what was promoted. give you a preview. Here's the references that you're all entitled to. The one that stands out here, where is I have it. Oh, here's the best 50. And one of these on here is by LeBon. I hope I have that on here. If not, I'll have to, oh, here. Currier Ives, America Imagined. This is the academic. He's actually a college professor. And it was published by the Smithsonian. Okay, we have any more questions? This print, by the way, is a large print of the skating at Central Park. This print is very popular and is used by costume designers like in Hollywood for movie sets of the period clothing. And this is so accurate, they can see how the women and the men were dressed in this part of the 19th century and so on. So that's it. Any more questions?
Yes, Joel, I have one more question. It's how did they decide what prints to make and what topics to pick?
I think it was pretty what the public was asking for. Well, some of the ideas were obvious, like the disasters, the Chicago fire and everything. I mean, that was pretty obvious. But some of the others was driven by the temperance union, by the women's rights people, the women asking for the vote. And they just picked up what the public, they just figured out what the public wanted. It was really a market-driven company, and that's how they proceeded. Any other questions?
Joel, maybe we could also tell the audience that currently several of your prints are in our brand new collection storage facility archive.
Sure. That's correct. There's about 30 of them down there in archival storage.
Yes, and once it's safe to open up again, we're planning on doing like select tours. So you will get a personal tour by Joel or one of our curators to come to our really nice new archival collection facility, and you can see them all. I just go down there to get inspired. It's really great. It's like my private art collection, and it's wonderful. They're really terrific.
We have some other questions here, Hildy.
Yeah.
The salaries of can you read those? Let's see. One was female art. I have no idea what they were. They made a living wage. Let me put it that way. I don't know what that would be back in 1860 or so. Whether the female was paid as much as the male, I don't know. I would guess maybe not, but that's just a guess. And was it a function of the quantity? I don't think so. But again, we don't have a lot of detailed records of that kind about, and that's a good question, because if it were by volume, if you made a print that sold extremely well, you should be rewarded more. But I'm not sure exactly if that were the case.
And then one more question, Joel. Why your interest in collecting Currier Ives or art? Were your parents collectors?
No. My sister's on here, so I have to be careful what I say here. But no, we were not collectors at that time. My parents came out of the Depression, and that was not that wasn't uppermost on their minds at that time. But no, it was a very good household and so on. But I picked up an interest. It's hard to say, because once I got into college, I was more interested in the Western civilization really than engineering, although I did okay in engineering, and it sort of developed from there. the initial interest in the Audubons and the maps and the Curriers was the artistic elements, the colors, the shapes, and that attracted me. And then, like anything else, as you stay with it, you begin to realize the importance of it, or the background of it, or the history of it, et cetera, et cetera. So that's how it sort of developed. I didn't get my first real prints until probably in the 1960s. I think I was in Germany or somewhere. But that's it's really hard to put your finger on how these things develop. Oh, the other reason for prints, when my wife worked in the city, and I worked out in Jersey and traveled a lot. So we didn't really have a house, we had apartments. And collecting was always in my blood. And prints were good because you could stick them under the bed, quite frankly. So there was a very practical aspect to the collecting. I see there's a question here about the Japanese woodcuts. Yeah, it was a similar thing. She's asking about the woodcuts. The Japanese woodcuts were made, and then they were sold to the public, and they were framed by the people as they wanted to. And they were probably very inexpensive at the time. And today, again, the price of the Japanese woodcuts are based on the availability and the quality of the print. And some of the particular, like Hiroshima, Shigi, Hokusai are very popular artists of the time. Okay. Any other questions? Well, I certainly am happy that everybody was able to join us. And I was really happy that my sister was able to join us from Florida, and my niece from Denver. And her last name is Fujiwara, so you might get the idea that her husband is Japanese from Hawaii. So I'm sure that they'll be interested in some of the Japanese prints.
Thank you everyone for being with us tonight. And I just put the link for the next talk in the chat function. You can also just go to our website and sign up. And as Joel indicated, if all our virtual programs, we're piloting in terms of topics and themes, and Joel's very generous with his time and sharing his collection this way. So hopefully we'll be able to put together a whole series.
So thank you everybody for coming, and I certainly enjoy discussing the prints, and I appreciate the questions.
Thank you, and good night everyone. Have a good night.